Welcome to this little fireside chat here that I got going on. I really wanted to just talk about this guy, my Sony a7R5, and the fact that I switched from Canon about a year ago. I wanted to talk about the things that I've regretted from switching from Canon to Sony, and then also things that I've really enjoyed about the Sony system now that I've been using it for give or take a year. By the way, I hope you all enjoy this setup. I thought this would be a little bit more of a podcast-esque video, more conversational. In fact, I'm going to be calling Mackey in a little bit and getting his opinions because he also switched from Canon to Sony a little bit before I did. For context, before I bought the Sony a7R5, I had both the Canon EOS R5 and the Canon R6 Mark II. There's actually a YouTube video on that where I walk around Germany. So if you want to see that video, I'll have it linked in the description. But really the first thing is the body design and really the comfortability of the grip. Now this is the a7R5, which is one of their higher end Sony cameras. And I know they've gotten better with like their A1, but that being said, I don't know, it's the design language of the grip itself. The best way I can describe it is if you're a gamer like I am, PlayStation controller versus an Xbox controller. There's something about an Xbox controller that's just more comfortable than those DualShock controllers. I think the same thing can be said about the Sony cameras. When you grip a Canon camera, it's just like, yes, that is correct. And when I grip a Sony camera, it's not that it's wrong, it's just less comfortable. And when you go from a really comfortable system to Sony, that is definitely one of the things you notice, especially because you're holding this thing every single day. And kind of on a similar topic of comfortability, I'm gonna go ahead and say the Sony menus, while being better now that they've updated it with that main page, is still just not quite as simple or easy to use as those Canon menus. Now this one could be biased, I completely understand that because I grew up using Canon menus from the Canon 70D all the way up to the EOS R6 Mark II. But when I look at Sony menus, for some reason to me, they just are not super easy to navigate. Both the Sony and Canon cameras are fabulous when it comes to autofocus. In fact, I think they are the two best in the game. Some would say that Sony's better, some would say that Canon's better. I'm not gonna say either one is better in this video. I think they're very, very comparable. However, I will say that I find that the touch tracking UI and really just the touch screen in general on Canon cameras is more pleasing and easy to use. There's something about the UI of the Sony camera that, does it look old? I don't know. Maybe old isn't the right way to put it, but I feel like whenever I'm using the touchscreen on the Sony camera, I'm just not as happy with it as with Canon. Now let's talk about one of the bigger deals that I have regretted with my Sony. Do I really regret it? I don't know, but it's definitely something that I've noticed. E-mount versus RF mount. Now this is a positive and a negative. The positive is with E-mount, there's a huge backlog of lenses and third-party lenses that you have access to on the Sony system, and that is fabulous. The reason why Canon switched to RF and Nikon switched to that new massive Z mount is with a larger mount, you're able to get a larger aperture and you're able to have better stabilization and you're able to have more compact large lenses like that 70-200 RF lens that's just a little bit shorter than the Sony 70-200. Not to say that the Sony G Master 70-200 isn't a fabulous lens. It is, but with a larger mount, which Sony opted not to do, that's definitely a downside. And occasionally I do go back and shoot on Canon cameras. I used the C80 recently, and then also I used the Canon R5 still a lot in some of my production work. And I will say that those RF lenses are amazing. With that though, RF lenses, you had much less options for third parties, so that was the downside. I mean, one of the larger reasons why I left Canon was because of the fact that they didn't allow third-party RF lenses. It's a positive and a negative, but I will say if Sony had switched to a larger mount like Nikon and like Canon, that could have been a massive benefit long-term, even though it hurt them short-term. By the way, guys, if you're enjoying the music and the vibes of this whole thing, that is being supplied by Artlist. Artlist is an amazing platform for not just music, but you also have sound effects and graphics and a ton of other stuff on their site.
Like AI voiceovers.
I've been using them pretty much exclusively for my YouTube channel for the last 4 months or so, and I do not regret it. The quality of the music and the sound effects on Artlist are really amazing. So if you're enjoying the vibes in this video and you're liking the music, I definitely recommend checking out Artlist. There'll be a link in the description if you want to try them out for yourself. So those were the things that I've missed from Canon now that I've switched over to Sony, but I'm gonna go ahead and tell you the things that I've really enjoyed now that I've had a Sony camera with the a7R5. And the first one's going to be S-Log3 and dynamic range. When I switched from Canon to Sony, the R5 Mark II was not out, the Canon C80 was not out, the C400 was not out, and all of these hybrid mirrorless cameras were limited to C-Log3, which in my opinion is far from Canon's best log profile. I much prefer Canon C-Log2 because it has much more dynamic range, which is what S-Log3 is for Sony. I know that can get a little bit confusing, but S-Log3 is the best log profile that Sony offers, and they just give it to you in all of their cameras. And so that was really enticing to me because I felt like even though my Canon camera was really good with those specs, like the R5 was 8K, but it was still C-Log3. And I could always see it really noisy in the shadows or darker parts of my image. And I just couldn't get it out with my R5 and even my R6 Mark II. I just never really enjoyed C-Log3. That may not be your experience. Maybe you have figured out a really great workaround for C-Log3, but for me, that was always an issue. So I've really enjoyed S-Log3. I feel like the footage coming out of this camera, and this isn't even a proper video camera, the FX3 would probably have been a better choice for me, but I didn't make that choice. S-Log3 is just such an amazing codec, and I really love the dynamic range that I've been able to get out of it. Again, at the time, more modern Canon cameras weren't out, like the C400 with the triple base ISO, but at the time, they only had one base ISO, which was 800, but with Sony cameras, you had dual base ISO. So in this one, it's 640 and 2500, correct me if I'm wrong. On the FX3, it goes all the way up to 12,800 ISO. And this is a really big deal because oftentimes you're not shooting in ideal lighting. So actually in this case, just so you guys know, I'm shooting on Lumix cameras and their second base ISO is 4,000, which I actually like a lot. But having a second base ISO is such an advantage, especially for run and gun creative stuff when you don't have time to light. In fact, I'm using my Blue Eddy power bank to power some work lights to help light this scene, which probably isn't the best lighting job I've ever done, but it works. So now, of course, Canon is doing triple base ISO, but we haven't seen Sony's answer to that yet, so we'll see what that looks like in the near future. Now, this one is specific to this camera, although Sony has implemented it into other cameras as well now that we're in the future, but it is the tilt and flip around screen. Wow. That's actually why specifically I picked this camera. As dumb as it is, that one feature, I was like, okay, 2500 base ISO versus 12,000. I can kind of make that work, but really all I cared about was this flip screen. As a YouTuber, this is what I want because if I'm taking photos, this is the better way, the tilt screen. But if I'm filming myself, which is my job, I really need that flip around screen to be able to do that. That feature for specifically this camera was amazing. This is a really small thing, but I'll mention it anyways. Full-size HDMI on the Sony a7R5 was a really nice touch. It does come up every once in a while, and having micro HDMI on Canon, I always just felt like that would break. Canon has since fixed this. I just don't know why we do micro HDMI in cameras of this size. That was always so weird to me. Now this one might be a little bit silly, but one of the things that I really loved about Sony, and this is kind of specific to YouTube in all fairness, but it's the community around it. I feel like the Sony community is just much stronger than Canon. Canon really doesn't seem to want to talk to us, the audience, you guys. They don't really seem to want our feedback on what makes their cameras good. Now, eventually they did get around to it with these latest cameras, but it took them a long time to do that for the information that we wanted to get to the actual engineers in designing the cameras. I feel like Sony listens much better, so the community around these cameras is just a little bit more robust. I really appreciate when camera companies are willing to listen to us. In fact, I've had many conversations with the actual Sony engineering team, and we're able to provide our specific feedback. And it doesn't always come to fruition, but it's really cool that they're willing to listen to us. Let's pivot and talk about Canon cameras that are interesting to me in 2024, cameras that are starting to stand out. One that I got to use recently, and I have a YouTube video on it if you want to see my first experience with it, but it's the Canon C80. Obviously, that 6K triple base ISO sensor is wildly appealing to me. I probably shouldn't have this so close to the fire. I'm gonna set it down there. In my experience, it was a lovely camera to use. The FX6 is probably the most comparable Sony camera to the C80, but that camera's getting a bit older now. That is a 4K 12 megapixel sensor, and it totally looks great. There's nothing wrong with that sensor, but I do feel like we are pushing more into 6K being the new standard, especially when using anamorphic lenses like I'm using right here. You want to have like a 6K open gate sensor so that you have a better resolution when you're stretching out these pixels. Obviously, the R5 II is interesting because it is the updated version of my R5. And what did they fix? They fixed the micro HDMI, so now it's full. And then they also fixed my biggest complaint, which was C-Log 3. They gave us C-Log 2, which is really fabulous. For me, that's just a little bit late. They should have given us that in an update or something along the lines in the R5, but they didn't. But I do love the form factor, of course, and the body of the R5 Mark II, because the R5 was such a stellar camera in that sense. So that camera is pretty interesting to me as well. Now, a great friend of mine, Mackey, has also made the switch from Canon to Sony about a year and a half ago. And I thought it'd be interesting to hear his thoughts and see if he regrets anything now that he's made the switch.
I had the R5 and I had the R5C. I also owned the C70 for like 6 months as well. The R5C screwed me over multiple times on very important shoots. It was like kind of the point of what is Canon doing? But then it was the fact that they took away third-party support for lenses. And I kept seeing all these amazing lenses come out, like that 35 to 150. I was like, I'll never be able to use that. And then I started to learn about Sony and S-Log 3. Oh, that's the other thing, the freaking C-Log 3 on other cameras. I think they now have C-Log 2, but I'm like, the fact they took so long to do that, I'm just like, I don't want to invest my money into this brand because I don't know if they're actually looking out for our best interests. And I switched over to the Sony a7R5 and the FX6, and then I ended up getting the FX3, and I have the Sony a7C II, which I'm filming on, and a million other cameras, including Nikons and Lumix and all of them.
The C-Log 3 thing was honestly probably the biggest thing for me too, and that's why I jumped ship from Canon. And I love S-Log. I'm curious if you have any regrets switching from Canon to Sony, or if it's all roses.
Only thing that I've missed so far is Canon. They do have unique lenses, specifically their 28 to 70. It's no longer unique because now Sony has an option like that. But more importantly, their 70 to 200 2.8 is very small. Even more importantly, on top of that, their 70 to 200 f4. I absolutely love that lens because you're able to vertically put that into your bag and the bag will close. Like, that's the only telephoto I know of, and the quality was still pretty good on it too. Aside from that, I literally don't miss anything. I don't miss the poor battery life, the poor dynamic range and having it underexposed to reserve highlights. The colors are just fine on Sony now. I don't have any issues with it. I don't regret it at all.
That being said, I mean, we can talk about it since it's part of the conversation. What about these other cameras like Lumix? What do you think that they're bringing to the game, and is that enticing you to leave Sony, or is it just something adjacent to Sony?
Now it's kind of become a thing where I feel like I need to own multiple cameras from different companies, because no company is making just like one great camera. When it comes to any type of open gate for run and gun or content creation or anything like that, Lumix just is perfect for that. Their cameras are super small. The autofocus works well enough now. And then for anamorphic support, the Lumix is just amazing. But then if I want better quality with full frame open gate, then the Blackmagic Pixis comes into play. But if I want internal RAW without dealing with the cinema camera, the Nikon Z8 and Z6 III comes into play. I say Sony cameras are boring for the fact that they just work. They kind of do everything we need. If Sony was to give us open gate and internal RAW on, cameras in 2025.
Oh yeah, no, I know. I think that they're a little bit behind right now. It feels like everyone has released their cameras and Sony, for some reason, is holding their cards to their chest. I think 2025 is going to be an interesting year for Sony. We'll see how they answer all these new cameras. There are now Canon cameras that answer all of the complaints that you and I had. C70 now has the C80, which is full frame, has a 6K sensor, triple base ISO. R5 Mark II now has C-Log 2, full-size HDMI. And I'm assuming I know the answer is it's too little too late. Is that the case? Or are those cameras enticing because you get those Canon colors without the drawbacks that we hated?
I want to say it's too little too late. Canon's lost my trust. I'm not about to go spend my money on a camera where the manufacturer I know is more worried about preserving their higher end cameras than giving us cameras that are actually going to make our lives easier for the things we do. Even though they've been gatekeeping their C-Log 2 up until now, it's too late. Even though they're letting some third-party manufacturers create RF manual focus lenses or Super 35 lenses, like, I still don't trust that. And dare I say, Sony is now about to approach that. The fact that other companies are giving us internal RAW and open gate. Every camera is good now, so it's going to come down to these added features that give us more options. I think whatever companies start doing that are going to start winning over some of the pie. 2025, I think it's going to be the year for Nikon and Lumix if Sony doesn't, again, answer to the things that those companies are doing. Well, quick question for you. Are you thinking about switching back to Canon?
Not yet. And that's just because we haven't seen too many of Sony's answers to these Canon cameras. So all these cameras don't come out at the same time. Canon's newest line came out first, so we're kind of waiting to see the new FX line from Sony. We did see their new A1 camera, which is pretty cool, but it is expensive. And even though Canon's RF glass is amazing, I will say that Sony's G Master lenses are beautiful as well. I do feel like with my 24 to 70 and my 70 to 200 that I essentially have a prime lens that's also a zoom lens, because it just gives you that rich and creamy bokeh that you want, but in a zoom lens. I think that Sony's gonna crush it with their new camera, so I'm not too worried about it yet. I will say though that while the Canon Sony feud just keeps trucking along, Lumix and Nikon are doing some pretty incredible things on the sidelines. That Nikon ZF camera is absolutely stunning. I love the retro design. I think that Canon should do that with their AE1. Additionally, Lumix with their S5 IIX and S9, which is what I'm using right now for this video, I think they're stellar cameras with pretty unique features that Sony and Canon just need to learn from. Again, is Sony better? Is Canon better? I think that they're both really comparable right now, but there's some interesting competition coming up from their flanks. And if Canon and Sony don't figure out, I think that they're gonna take a large share of the camera market coming soon. Or there's not really a poor choice to make these days, but let me know down in the comments, which one is your preference? Are you team Sony? Are you team Nikon? Or are you on the sidelines with Lumix, Nikon, or something of the works? Thanks so much to Artlist for sponsoring this video, and for Mackey for jumping in on a call to have a conversation about this topic. I think that was pretty cool. And again, if you wanna see my initial thoughts of the Sony a7R5 when I first switched from Canon, click this video right here. I hope that you all enjoyed this conversation. If you did, leave a like, and I will see you all in the next one. Take it easy, guys.